Hey guys, it's Professor Hips. I'm going to walk you through federalism and nationalism. All right, these are really critical principles to American government, and understanding the sharing of power between the federal and state governments is a really critical piece as we move forward and talk about the media, as we talk about civil rights and civil liberties. So I really want you to take some time to read this chapter in the textbook, to watch this video, to make sure that you feel comfortable moving forward with federalism and how federalism operates. So I want you to understand federalism. I'd like you to explore the strengths of a federal and state government system. We're going to talk about how federalism works and how it's changed over time. We'll talk about some of the conflicts that exist with federalism. And finally, we'll explore sort of American nationalism, or this idea, force, concept that shapes how we share power between different levels of government. So Ferguson, Missouri is a really interesting example of how federalism works. So we had the sort of race riots that took place in Ferguson, Missouri, the unrest, the social unrest as a result of some inequities that exist in that particular area. And what we found was there was confusion about how essentially power would work there. Would the state government handle it with local state police forces getting in on the action, or would this be something where the federal government intervened and brought to bear the resources of the federal government? So the fundamental question at hand is, who should have control over their respective populations? Should a state be in charge of the people in that state, or should the federal government provide an overarching plan for what should happen in terms of government? There's also the issue of who should decide who wins if there's a conflict between the two entities. And there's going to be conflict between the state and federal government because both levels of government want to maintain power. So there are three essential types of political systems that I'd like you to be familiar with. The first is a unitary system. In a unitary system, power rests with the government. All right, power rests with the government. And government then issues that power out to the people in terms of laws and edicts and rules. In a confederal system, there is power derived almost exclusively from the people, almost exclusively from sort of these entities that are made up of the people, and they give power to the government directly. In a federal system, there is a national government that rules on occasion and state governments that rule on occasion. Both levels of government are sometimes sovereign, meaning sometimes they wield power. Now, part of this is a function of the fact that there's not a lot of trust in government, that most people don't trust the federal government, and most people trust their state government and local governments more. Part of the reason is that they're more familiar with the people who run their state governments. They're more familiar with the people who run their local governments. So it's likely that they know their local officials, that they know their state officials, which makes them feel more connected and therefore more likely to get involved on a state level of government. Now, there are some advantages to both the state running things and the federal government running things. The advantage of state level authority is, first, states are more responsive to the needs of their citizens. States are closer to the people that live in their state, both figuratively and literally, and therefore they might be better acquainted with what people in a particular region need. The needs of folks in Georgia are very different than the needs of folks in Montana, which are very different than the needs of folks in California. Because the United States is so broad and we have such different cultures and populations and sort of ways of life, it's a challenge to have a singular set of rules that govern all of those people. Secondly, states usually offer more protections for individual rights. So we see states that are more willing to protect individuals than maybe the federal government is. Part of it, again, is ease of protecting those individuals because they're familiar with what that particular population needs. Third, states foster political innovation, meaning states are what we call laboratories of democracy, or places where we're able to test certain policies on a smaller scale before we apply them to a national scale. And finally, federalism gives people more choices. Because there are 50 states, in theory, there are 50 different forms of government. And that gives people the option of finding the form of government that is best suited to them. However, everything is not perfect when it comes to state governments. The national government also does some things really well, and there are explicit reasons why a national government that has power might be a better system of government. First, national policy is often more fair. Because the national government has to worry about more people being affected by their policies, they tend to value fairness and justice as a quality that's important in the policies that they pass. Secondly, national government is able to normalize or equalize resources across the nation, meaning we don't end up suffering from the poor state, wealthy state problem. For example, a law that's passed in Massachusetts may have a better chance of being successful because Massachusetts is a wealthier state. States that are less wealthy, a state like Mississippi, for example, may have more trouble implementing a particular law because they don't have the funding to be able to sustain it. Third, national policies can be standardized and meet best practices, meaning national government has the ability to leverage information from all 50 states and make educated and logical choices. Finally, the national government can coordinate more effectively than maybe a state can with all the different entities of government. So if the federal government decides they want to run a policy a particular way, it just has to be coordinated within the federal government. If a state government decides it wants to operate in a particular way, they have to convince not only the state government, but make provisions for the federal government to be involved. They're going to have to make provisions for local governments to be involved. It's a little bit messier when it's handled on a state level as opposed to the national level. So now that you have a background of sort of the national government power versus state government power, we're going to take a look at how federalism works. So there are some ground rules that are important to understand when it comes to federalism. The first is that there are what we call granted or enumerated powers, powers that are written down in the Constitution, and those are powers that are granted to particular levels of government. So Article 1, Section 8 lays out the powers of the federal government. So the federal government has the ability to pay debts, which means it can also raise money. It can raise an army. It can establish the post office. It can handle U.S. foreign policy. Those are things that state governments are not able to do. And because those powers are written down, they're not debatable. The Constitution also gives the federal government the power to do whatever is necessary and proper to carry out its duties. So, if one of the duties of government is to protect the people, the government is then able to do, Congress is able to do what is necessary and proper to protect the people. It's known as the elastic clause. It's a hugely powerful opportunity for the federal government to be able to take advantage of its power and really protect the people in whatever way it feels is most effective. Now, it also creates a problem because the federal government being granted that much power gives them authority that is really, really difficult to curtail. It's really, really difficult to take that power and limit it. Now, there's also another brand of powers that are critically important, but are a little bit messier to describe. So there's something known as the elastic clause, right? We just talked about it, the necessary and proper clause. What that does is it means that government has the authority to engage in what are known as inherent powers, or powers that simply come with the authority of Congress. And because of that elastic clause, because of the necessary and proper clause, we see that Congress is able to do a lot of things that are not explicitly written down. The final power that is granted to the national government, and that is a critical power, is the supremacy clause. This is the clause that makes the federal government the supreme law of the land. Another important component of federalism is the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That's a very eloquent way of saying if it's not written in the Constitution that the federal government can do it, or it's not written in the Constitution that state governments can't do it, those powers belong to the states. It's really a way of ensuring that states are able to retain power regardless of the supremacy clause and the fact that we have a national government. Now, it's important to understand that because of the 10th Amendment, we have something called concurrent powers. These are powers that are shared between both the state level governments and the federal government. So both state and national governments, or state and federal government, have the power to tax, they have the power to build roads and create infrastructure, they have the power to borrow money, they're able to regulate business, and the Constitution also directs each state to give what we call full faith and credit to the actions of other states. So the easiest way to think about full faith and credit is in the way that your license works. So although you get a license that's issued in one particular state, that license is good in every state in the country. So you can have a license from Georgia or a license from Tennessee and still be able to drive in other states with your license. That is full faith and credit, honoring states having to honor the contracts of other states. So essentially what we have are two forms of federalism. The first is what we call layer cake federalism. This is where there is a clear delineation of authority or power between the levels of government. So you have state level powers and national level powers, and rarely do those two mix. It's sort of like a traditional layer cake. On the other hand, we have what's known as marble cake federalism or cooperative federalism. This is the idea that the powers of state and federal governments are interspersed and intertwined, that you really can't have one without talking about the other. And thus, it's hard to figure out where one begins and one ends, more like a swirl or a marble cake. Sorry about that. So there are also some interesting modifications that have occurred when it comes to federalism. The first is something called New Federalism. So since Ronald Reagan's presidency, it ushered in this idea or this concept of New Federalism. It's where we move from what were known as categorical grants, which is money given by the government for a specific purpose, to this idea of block grants, or large sums of money that are given to states that they're able to use with a little bit more discretion. So states are able to figure out where they need that money the most and then use it where it's most effective. Now, you want to understand that when this money is given to states, there's competition within the state for who should get that money. So we're going to see the federal government has things that they'd like to see that money go to, states have things that they'd like to see that money go to, and localities have certain programs that they'd like to see that money go to. All right, this is an example of how that cooperative or marble cake federalism works. So, how does federalism work today? Sorry about the messages that are popping up. But federalism today basically operates on something called devolution, which is the idea that government is starting to transfer power from the federal government back to state and local governments. All right, states' rights advocates have always argued that states should have more power, but we're starting to see that happen more over time. The assumption is also that that will increase with the Republican president, that he will start to give more of the power back to individual states. Now, the issue with this is that oftentimes what happens is the federal government still expects certain things to happen. So they give what's called an unfunded mandate, where they want a law or a regulation imposed. They want a state to do something, but they're not going to provide the funding for you to do it. All right, these are the worst sort of ways for the government to operate because it's the government expecting you to behave in a certain way, but not providing the funds for you to be able to do it. So states sometimes find themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place. So the question is our central government weak or strong? So we have this sharing of power, and we've always argued that we have a strong federal government, but the question is, do we? Well, when we look in sort of a comparative sense, we find that one, we're smaller than a lot of other wealthy nations. So our government is not that big when compared to other comparable governments. Two, we always have preferred people participating in government as opposed to sort of centralized power. So although we do have a strong national government, we also want people to participate in government. So we sort of spread out the functions of government so that more people are able to access it. And finally, we see that independence plays a key role in the way that our government operates. Individual people sort of see government more as reflective of their individual concerns than other countries do. So we see a lot of situations arise where Americans feel like they should wield power even in places where they traditionally might not do that. So to sort of wrap it all up, federalism is this sort of intense debate about the very fabric of who we are. Are we a nation that's run by a strong federal government, or are we a nation where states have a ton of power and the federal government just sort of acts as a referee in case anything bad happens? We've seen this debate constantly between states and localities and the sharing of power. And we've seen throughout time power shift from the federal government back to state governments, back to the federal government. And the most interesting thing is that federalism, generally speaking, is the hallmark of a weak national government. That if you're going to have states that retain a ton of power, that you're going to see weak national government. States are going to try to retain power. However, in America, we've been able to largely balance states retaining power with a strong, powerful, responsive national government. So we have been able to do both throughout most of our history, and the hope is that we're able to continue to do that. So that is an overview of how federalism works. We'll spend a little bit of time in class talking about specific examples of how federalism works, but I wanted you to have an overview so you feel comfortable. As always, I hope that you'll read the book, that you'll watch this video as many times as you need to. If you have any questions, you can call me, email me, text me, or as always, save your questions and ask them in class. Happy studying.